Hi, everybody, as you're putting your details into the chat box, which is great. If you also have any questions as we go along, there is a Q&A box, so you can put questions in at any point in time for any of our speakers or panelists, and we'll answer them as we can or towards the end of the Q&A. And welcome to How COVID is Changing Education, Addressing the CX and EX Challenges, or as I call it, our virtual classroom today. So just quickly get started. So in case, I'm assuming that some or many of you, this is your first time at any of our CXC events. So welcome to Customer Experience Challenges. I'm Brittany Hobbs. Way ahead. I'm Brittany Hobbs. I am one of the moderators for these events, and I'm also the head of research for a company called PH1 Research. We're one of the organizing sponsors for this event. And I just wanted to let you know, as we're going through today, we know that these virtual events are all a little bit tricky because you only get to say so much. You only get to really put in your questions, and the rest of us are talking the whole time. So we have been hearing what will help you the most. And we are offering a working session on Friday as well, where it's limited seating, but it's an opportunity to really go through some of the topics that we're going to be hearing about today, and in particular, talking about prospective students and what can be done about innovating that experience, and where do we go from here from some of the things that we're going to be hearing about today. We also have a number of other events. We've been putting on events since about 2018, typically about kind of the wider range of customer experience and employee experience topics. And so we've got some more about tourism and hospitality, as well as how organizations become adaptive and resilient. So as we go into it today, like I mentioned, I'm from PH1 Research. So we are Canada's leading customer experience consultancy, and we really work on things like customer experience audits, things like student engagement and student experience, and mapping some of those experiences and what you can do in terms of strategic implementation moving forward. We also have an annual sponsor, which is Qualtrics XM. They are an experience management tool software. They are in particular offering one of their, their suite of services that are free to kind of anyone that wants to use them right now, all about sentiment tracking and really helping organizations of all sizes get their employees and their customers or students back to work or back to class. So COVID-19, I mean, that's really why we're here, unfortunately. This crisis has really forced many industries to innovate. I think that that's something that everyone really understands. But no industry has had to innovate as quickly and as wholly as education. So we've been pushing millions of students and educators to digital really quickly, which I think is going to be really fascinating because it identifies some of the biggest pain points with digital education very quickly. And that going backwards, going back to kind of what we knew of education isn't really an option anymore. It can make things more difficult than it needs to be. So what is that middle ground? What do we need to do from here? As you can see, we've gone from these huge lecture halls to having 30, 100, 500 students all on a Zoom all at once. And these are business tools. These are tools that were originally intended for meetings. They weren't intended for cross collaboration and high engagement. For any student who's planning or considering to go to university for the first time or to go back to university who maybe has only had, one or a couple of years there, the product that they're buying has fundamentally changed. The stressors and the motivators that drove them has fundamentally changed. And between our research, the research of others, it's shown that not only has this generation had extreme anxiety around debt load, around making the right choices, just generally doing what was expected of them. But now they have this added stress that's coming around having to make a decision about whether or not continuing with education in 2020 and 2021 is the right choice for them. There was one study in particular in the UK that was looking at not only, what is shifting in terms of how education is happening and what student perceptions of it are, but they looked at where things are right now and also looked backwards at the 2018 financial crisis on recent graduates and graduates of the past couple of years previous to that. And it was showing that people who are graduating from university in the midst of a financial crisis are not only seeing immediate issues in terms of unemployment and lower wages, but those issues are following them through a wider course of their career than if they had graduated a couple of years before or after the financial crisis. And so they're seeing that, there might be another 600,000 people in the UK between the ages of 18 to 24 who are expecting to become unemployed this year, which is a 150% increase. So those are all things that are weighing on people as they're going through this. So what do we do about it? We're looking at not only is we've had for a while online schools, sort of these large all-encompassing campuses and urban campuses. Having an online school as that kind of third campus isn't necessarily anything new. What's new about it is, the way that people are maybe looking at online school or online education differently than how they previously had. So you've got these large campuses where everything is centralized, where it's, you have everything all in one place. It's a big experience. And then you have things like an urban campus where maybe you don't have the same kind of mentorship or the same sort of, vibrant student-only experiences, but you have these really wide swath of being hybrid, away from your home. You're getting to have all these additional experiences about being in the middle of an urban center. And then you have an online school where there's an entirely different feeling that you have to build around it in terms of what is the root cause or what's the root need that people have in terms of education. And some of these really interesting ones, like we're going to hear from today, like Coursera, where it's a hybrid model, where it's online as well as in campus. And then Quantic, where I actually did my MBA, and it's fabulous, but it's a totally different experience. And so, we're really looking at what is the right model, what are the right ways to innovate on that experience. And it comes to these questions, we're looking at what do students need to succeed post-COVID? So there are more questions now than there are answers. What's the value of a degree without the social and mentorship experience available on campus? How many of this year's incoming class will defer? What is the opportunity to innovate the model and not just the tools that we're using? So what education model could be more anti-fragile? What curriculum would better prepare the job market and prepare students for the job market and to think critically in times of uncertainty, which we've been hearing in our research has been a shocking thing of students being underprepared. And most importantly, what do educators need to succeed post-COVID? And what should the role of educators be post-COVID? So really quickly, we've got some really fabulous things today. We've got Angèle Beausoleil, who's going to be taking us through a quick presentation about driving innovation in traditional education, as well as a panel with Angèle, Tom Adams from Quantic, and Matthew Konak from Coursera. So I'm going to post it over to Angèle to tell us a little bit about her presentation.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Brittany. I'm going to, here we are, I'm going to pass it over to my screen and share with you my, my presentation I prepared. And I just want to say that when Brittany first reached out to me and asked this question in terms of, so how is COVID going to change education? It has already, so we all, those of us within an educational sector have certainly felt it. But what it did, it really allowed me to think, how do I answer this question? And immediately as a professor within a more traditional university setting, I think about my profession and my colleagues. And then I paused and I thought, hang on a second here. Let me go back and let's just think about my own personal learning journey. And I thought the path that I took from where I am today backwards, I think actually gives us a bit of a view in terms of maybe the changing or maybe not so radical change of education we've seen over time. And so I thought what the question posed and joining the panel today afforded me was to kind of go back and go, how much has education really changed over, let's say, 50 to 100 years? And so I took that on as a bit of a challenge, and I've put together a bit of a presentation today that might surprise you. Maybe it'll bring you back to your own youth, and hopefully, if nothing else, it'll have you reflect on the role and the change within education, and perhaps the ever-evolving sort of the human and the learner in all of us. And so I thought, in terms of change, we often, and I'm an innovation scholar, so my own journey is, I was rural raised. Right now, I'm located in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and I was raised about 2.5, 3 hours north of the city in a French Canadian village. And this small village, so I'm rural raised, rural educated in terms of elementary and high school, then came to the big city, got an undergraduate degree from Ryerson, and then I went out west and I worked in industry for about over 20 years in a variety of roles, and then decided to get a doctoral degree. And the reason I'm sitting back here in Toronto after being out west, I went out west for those 20 years, got a PhD from University of British Columbia, came back, and now as a professor, it's just a very, very interesting perspective and point of view of being able to work, of course, across the country in a variety of roles, to have been a practitioner, so I'm called a pracademic, to have enjoyed learning and working with a variety of educational institutions as well as educational technology companies. And those have really formed my own opinion, my perspective in terms of education, and having, and especially my age, having seen literally over 50 years, the educational experience change. What I was maybe a bit surprised is when I really looked back, and this presentation is going to surface some of this, is that frankly there's a lot more incremental changes that have actually happened, particularly even over the last 100 years, than radical. And I just want to highlight that, because in order to answer how COVID may change education, let's pause to think, can we learn from the past? Can we learn from the present? Will it give us a hint in terms of the future? And so the first conversation around education is, well, where do we learn? Where do we learn? We all know as children, we learn through play, and we learn wherever we go. It doesn't have to be in a formal setting. It can be super, super casual. And so I thought, let's just have a look in terms of past and present, and just consider that in the past, and this is actually a photo taken in the early 20th century, you know, these are just kids playing on the sidewalks. They're learning all kinds of things. I'm sure they're probably learning not just how to play, but how to strategize. Probably there's some leadership skills happening there. But there's a really interesting way of learning that we might call more socialized learning. And then on the opposite side here, this modern image, by the way, this was taken just a few years ago. These are actually summer Harvard students. And you think, well, how different is learning if we think of learning in these more socialized and more experiential contexts? And I'd go, not that much, not much has changed. And if we think of, well, maybe it's about radical changes around where we learn, well, I'm going to propose to you that maybe it's still in terms of incremental changes. So when we think of more formal settings, and Brittany highlighted this in terms of her presentation, so we can think of those kind of places and those spaces of learning. And of course, when we think back, historically, those places were one-room schoolhouses where still there were groups. It was a collective and shared experience. Of course, they were smaller, and yet you had an experience. You had an instructor and a teacher, and you had a place of learning. And again, if we think of, well, today, Our places of learning, of course, have gone high tech. The campuses in terms of higher ed are potentially massive. We have interesting places and spaces online, and yet how we celebrate our learning is still very social. We have a group, outside the one-room schoolhouse, and we have a group. In this case, these are a group of students from the University of Toronto Mississauga campus. And so I think, okay, so maybe the places haven't changed all that much, except the buildings have cost a lot more, and the properties, of course, in terms of the campus land. And then it's, okay, let's think about, well, what about how we teach? Maybe there have been these changes in terms of how we teach. And I think how interesting, in particular, being someone who is currently an educator, I've been an industry trainer and educator, now a formal professor, that I think, as a student, I like the blackboard. Blackboard still exists, actually, even on our campus at the Rotman School of Business. And yet what we have really swapped is maybe a blackboard to a whiteboard. And if you're fortunate to have been in certain schools, you'd have a smart board. And so the idea of that learning experience and using new mediums to communicate your lesson hasn't changed all that much. So let's think about that. And what about other materials that those of us who teach offer our students and our learners? And so we might have, of course, come from the years of textbook, and we still enjoy, of course, paper-based products in terms of books. However, but what we've done is we've just moved those books online. And instead of hardcover, we have covered laptops or tablets. And so again, these are kind of incremental changes in terms of how we teach. And then I paused and I thought, well, what about what we learn? That is when we really start seeing some radical changes over the probably more 75 and 100 years plus, in terms of our original doctrine was actually from scriptures. So as you likely know, when we think of education in its historical form and the introduction of the printing press, it was really religious leaders, those that were really in power, that were guiding us in terms of their ideologies and their philosophies, and essentially espousing their knowledge. So it was religious sort of leaders as our teachers. Okay, well, let's move that to 2020. And what we're learning is vast. It's different. It's multidisciplinary. We have everything from art and science and business economics, and we are reading it from a variety of sources, from professional research documentations all the way through to industry trade press, to publications such as National Geographic or The Economist as examples here. And so what we're learning and the influence in terms of what we're learning has changed dramatically, from the very few in terms of those that were really guiding in terms of a doctrine, to maybe a doctrine that has a political motivation and or point of view that is really a more industrial spin. So certainly we have seen some radical changes in terms of content. And then what about those channels? Brittany again has mentioned, and my colleagues on the panel today will really be speaking about sort of channels and platforms. And I just love comparing these two images to say, well, perhaps so many years ago we were, of course I wasn't alive then, but I certainly have photos of my parents, sitting next to the radio and really being completely in awe and consumed with the stories that were being shared by these voices, listening to the news, listening to murder mysteries that were being delivered through, of course, a selected set of channels controlled by very, very few networks at the time. And let's pop into today. We have a variety of networks. We have a variety of voices, of stories, of authors, of raconteurs, of storytellers who are sharing through podcasts, through YouTube, through a variety of mediums. Incredible new knowledge for some, maybe validating knowledge for others. And we're consuming that in terms of the new channels that we have chosen to purchase and consume the content with. So what we're learning is connected to how we're learning, and yet the stories and the news and maybe those murder mysteries are still great content, what we're learning. However, we're learning it in a more distributed, in a less only a few and broadcast by only a few to broadcast by many. So what we're learning is a diversity. We are learning knowledge that actually allows us to get a diversity of perspective and hopefully greater understanding and tolerance, especially for those news centers, especially as we all watch the COVID crisis every day now, is that we are hopefully more tolerant to different perspectives. And so what we're learning today is radically different than several years back. And then we have to think, so we've done, okay, a bit of what, a bit of where, and some how in terms of changes. But what's the why? Always has to come down to the why. What is the purpose of education? Why do we feel obligated to be educated? And this is where we see, is there much change over 100, 200, 300 years? I'll leave you to determine that. I will share my perspective in terms of knowledge is essentially the aim of education. How we consume it, where we consume it, our motivations will vary, but at the end of the day, it's truly knowledge, and in most cases, new knowledge that can then ideally inspire, impact our values, gives us perhaps a new intellect, a perspective, but ultimately, it's this knowledge that's going to give us the skills, give us those skills that are going to essentially impact society and positively impact our families. And so I think the purpose of education has changed very little, but so much around it has. And so this is a bit of a how has education changed over the past 100 years? And then suddenly on March 12th, 2020, the World Health Organization announces we are in a crisis. The global pandemic is officially called, and the world and our leaders, in terms of our nation leaders, have made some pretty brutal decisions. When it comes to education, we've seen immediately the schools have all been closed at all levels, from elementary, from daycare, elementary, secondary, all the way through to higher ed. This is significant. And in response, and I'm sure if those of you on our panel today and our call, you'll know that from a more traditional side of school, we had very, very little time. I personally had 2 days to redesign an entire, and I had 5 courses, to redesign 5 in-person experiences that were highly experiential, so not lecture style, and convert them in terms of virtual classroom experiences. So very, very little time to respond. However, the great news was there was a response, and it was swift from across the different levels of government, from civic, municipal, provincial, national, regional. And so the pandemic did trigger an incredible series of events for education. And there was actually some interesting changes that we can absolutely attribute to that particular day and to the way we currently live and work, socialize, and learn today and teach. And I thought as I sort of just present a few last points in my presentation, I wanted to highlight what I believe to be some interesting themes that I've observed around change. And first and foremost, choice, change by choice. This was probably the most dramatic I've personally have seen, and that was the choice about safety first. The world and the globe chose human health over economics. That's a radical first. So with choice comes a series of course, and a domino effect of all its impact. But the fact that change was driven by choice and a global perspective. The other was this concept of distance. We are all living in a social distant framework It's been imposed, it's been enforced. And what's really interesting is the evolution of remote or distant learning that has been around for nearly 100 years. And so I'm proposing, but I know my colleagues will have some great comments to add to this, is that it's e-learning 3.0. We've had lots of interesting concepts around distant learning. However, e-learning has really been introduced probably in the last 20, 30 years in full effort. And it's this idea of being able to, what used to be only those that were in remote locations that really want to, or homeschooling, needed to access platforms and books and materials to learn. And now we've gone from just a few of those sort of remote learners and students to the masses. So now it's about bringing virtual classrooms to the masses and in quick order. So that's a huge, I think, change in the impact of the concept of distance and the meaning of distance that we're going to see moving forward. Another change that I've personally seen is this idea of change by trial or change by experimentation. And this is where those of us that work deeply in terms of the education sector, the idea of this hybrid learning, again, Brittany mentioned this in the start of her presentation, and that the hybrid is really that combining, and what Coursera does, the combining the in-person with online. So hybrid learning is really the idea of complementing the way in which we learn, which is sensorial. So we are physical beings. We can use all of our technology-mediated devices, but the idea of really blending is important. But what I mean by change here is that I truly believe, and I'm seeing early indicators, that higher ed institutions particularly, and also secondary, are actually given a mandate to experiment. That is fantastic. The fact that we can now take a few more chances to actually try out and experiment new and diverse ways of teaching and learning is I think, a positive byproduct of this horrible crisis that we're all living in. And so change by experimentation, I think we're going to see huge, huge, huge changes simply by being given the mandate to move from traditional to something that is much more contemporary. And then my favorite, of course, is design. So change by design. And particularly is an area that I work within, which is learner experience design. And we're going to be speaking a bit about customer experience design and educator experience design. And really it's all in a very similar and very, very compatible and complementary way. But in this case, for education, in particular educational institutions, is of course you want to be student-centered. You need to be learner-centered. However, to deliver an experience that students are going to want to be attracted to, that they're going to want to either purchase or their parents, and that they're going to want to stay and be retained, is paramount. Just like industry, just like businesses, educational institutions are going to have to invest in learner experience design to deliver something that is distinctive, that's desirable, and that is higher valued perhaps, as opposed to another competitor's choice. Because there will need to be change in terms of why students actually choose one institution or a platform over another. And it will be, just like service design and customer experience design, it will be the design of the experience you offer that will distinguish you from others. So I think this is going to be a big one. And then my final sort of theme in terms of changes is the big one. And it's about the business model of educational institutions. Now in Canada, we have predominantly public institutions. In the US, very much a mix of private and public. In Europe, predominantly public and free education. And so some really interesting changes when we think of business models around the world. Every jurisdiction obviously has a different approach to how to attract, retain, engage, and provide that service, if you will, the knowledge into our citizens. And so I'm really probably approaching this from a North American perspective, in particular those institutions who depend on tuitions. And we up here in Canada, we depend heavily from our public institutions perspective on the international student fees. And so when you think of the limit in travel and the restriction in terms of mobility, and the desire to, well, do I need to actually go and experience something here at U of T, or perhaps at Harvard or at Stanford, et cetera, all of a sudden the choice of which campus you want to go to is not part of that decision-making process. It's going to be different. And so changes in business model have to look at those revenue sources. They're going to have to look and rethink essentially how they structure and resource the educational experiences. I personally see a huge, huge change from resourcing the educational experience from, let's say, a single lecturer or a professor to likely a digital teaching team. I think that's really exciting. There's some early experiments happening with those, where we're moving from a single sort of delivery individual and content expert to more of a team to really meet these multimodal, multi-sensorial experiences that are virtual. And they also have to rethink essentially what their value is. What is the value in terms of this entire chain? And this goes back to that learner experience design. Are they able to deliver a product, a service, an experience, again, that is unique and it's distinctive? And so there will need to be some radical changes in business models, which again, very interesting to see how it's going to happen, how it plays out even as the fall approaches. And so those are sort of my my takes in terms of some changes and of the last sort of 100 years or so. And I thought, well, maybe I'll kind of wrap this up in terms of let's reflect on some pretty critical eras of education over past 200 years. And again, think about these critical trigger points and different knowledge sort of focuses along the path, along from the past to the future. So I'll say I've introduced this a bit earlier, that really this great era of knowledge was very theological. This was coming from, again, more of the churches, the temples, and those leaders were the teachers, those religious leaders were the teachers. And so it was a doctrine that they were actually introducing. And then we moved from theological to cultural. This was really the era of the Renaissance. This is where art and science really came to be knowledge that citizens, society really created, demanded, and wanted. Then we moved to the industrial. This is where it was the era that ushered in economics, where we were looking for more practical set of skills. And then I'm going to propose to you that we are in, and likely about 50 years in, to the current era that I'm going to call computational. And this current era is computational. It really reflects the computer processing explosion in terms of power, the impact of personal computing, the greatest impact in terms of giant data networks around the world, the multidisciplinary, the ability to connect teams, connect knowledge centers, very, very powerful. And now, and perhaps with the trigger being COVID, we're now seeing a rush to blend that human and computer interaction as we haven't seen before. And educational institutions now have that mandate. And so with that, I'm going to, hopefully I've introduced a few concepts. I know I'm really excited about maybe exploring our current era of computational era of education with my colleagues and panelists. And we'll explore a bit of these themes and then others in terms of the next, I guess, hour or so. So thank you for listening and looking forward to jumping into the panel.
Thank you so much. That is, okay, turned off. Thank you so much. That's really great and like such a great perspective for us to start from. So really appreciate you taking us through all of that. Yeah. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to introduce the rest of the panelists. But while I do that, I have a poll that I would like everybody to participate in, and let's sort of see what the result is at the end. But I want to know, what part of education do you believe will need to change the most in the next 10 years? I'm gonna launch that and people can I'll show it afterwards. But in the meantime, I would like to introduce our panelists. So we have, Dr. Angèle Beausoleil, thank you so much. We'll continue on in our panel. We also have Tom Adams, who is the chairman and CEO and co-founder of Quantic School of Business. It's a lot of titles. Quantic School of Business and Technology. So for those of you that don't know, Quantic is the world's only accredited mobile-first graduate school. Tom also founded its parent company. Is it Pedago?
Pedago, yeah.
Okay. An educational technology lab that's making distance learning dramatically more effective, engaging, and affordable. Tom is the former chairman, CEO of Rosetta Stone, which he took public on the New York Stock Exchange. And he was previously on the management board at Bridgewater Associates, the hedge fund. He has an MBA from INSEAD and a BA from Bristol University, I can't talk today, and is an EY Entrepreneur of the Year national winner. Thank you for being with us. Very exciting, especially considering that you actually are doing what Angèle was saying is kind of one of the new innovative things in terms of having a teaching team. So we'll talk a little bit more about all of that in a second. We also have Matthew Koniak, who's the head of strategy and operations at Coursera. Matthew brings more than a decade of experience leading the transformation of large organizations. His career started in France and Saudi Arabia, where he was advising government agencies on their digital strategies. He moved to San Francisco in 2012 and has since managed the growth of several software as a service businesses. Most recently, he joined Coursera, the leading online learning platform for higher education, where he leads the strategy and operations team. So Coursera works with universities and other organizations to offer online courses, specializations, and degrees in a variety of subjects. So it's kind of a nice hybrid between online learning with that interaction with traditional education. And Angèle, you did such a fabulous job of introducing yourself, so I don't even think I need to continue on. Sorry, Tom, was that you that was?
No.
Oh, okay, perfect. All right, well, here, let's quickly share the results of our poll. So what part of the education do you believe will need to change the most in the next 10 years? Tuition and affordability. Interesting. All right, so people feel like it's not going to work with the business model that exists today. Let me just see if I can quickly share so everyone can see. Oh, can I hide? All right. Perfect. There we go. All right. So let's get started. You know, one of the big things I think that people keep saying is this idea of like everything is going to change. The world is so different. It's, you know, we're in such a different place, and a lot of companies and institutions are really struggling to make sense of how do we get to this place of uncertainty and how do we get through it? So the question is, help us understand. Has the coronavirus simply accelerated the inevitable when it comes to higher education needing to innovate, or is it just a perfect storm of problems that will pass once it's safe again? Anyone want to start? All right, let's start with you, Angèle.
Yeah. Okay, I was going to say, I thought maybe Tom and Sarah, I'll be really, really brief to make sure to leave the two of you. I was just going to say that I know I kind of hinted at this in terms of my presentation, but the idea of, you know, is it a perfect storm? I think the storm's been brewing a long time. I think what it is, it's a fascinating trigger. And what I'd like to propose that even though we're going to continue into uncertainty, those of us who were innovators or early adopters, we really saw this coming. And what is fantastic, we have two firms here with us today that have actually been kind of doing all the trials. You know, we've been doing lots of piloting. And so I think that's really fantastic. And I think whether or not it's a perfect storm or really, I think it's a matter of a forced sort of situation and shock. I believe we will all benefit from it, but I'll hand it over to my colleagues here to answer as well.
Yeah, and so from our perspective, I guess we've always sort of taken the view that traditional education created a huge, valuable sort of educational product, and you know that because people will kill their sibling or whatever to get into the right college, and so you knew that there was an enormous value that had been created. But our feeling was that a lot of the traditional online players had failed to replicate the value. And so we sort of took a step back and thought about, what is it fundamentally that is valuable in education? And I think it's skill development rather than sort of knowing specific things and sort of having facts and sort of traditional definitions of knowledge. And skills are learned by doing. And so we sort of looked at the traditional mode of education online and said needs to be much more interactive. So we developed the whole interactive format. And then obviously we wanted to trump the traditional university models by being radically accessible. And so we went mobile first. And then, as a sort of the last two pieces are that we made it also radically affordable, and then managed to draw lots of applications and essentially create the selection dynamic that we think is inherent in higher ed's value in terms of it creating this peer community between students and so on. And so we were at work for a long time trying to essentially shape what we thought was something that was more analogous to traditional education offerings from a value perspective, and at the same time disrupting, obviously, from a cost perspective. When you look at the advent of this pandemic and what it brings about, is I think it sort of brings a lot of people into being triers, where historically they may not have considered getting an MBA from a sort of online only provider. And now it kind of makes sense. It makes more sense than doing some of the traditional alternatives. And so we're getting a lot of trials and a lot of applications. So that's obviously wonderful. But the design, the thinking behind it is not sort of brought on by COVID. It's much more that we were skating somewhere, and since Angèle is from Canada, I'll use the ice hockey analogy. We're skating somewhere, and the puck has kind of come to us much faster than we thought it ever would.
Yeah,
and so we're very excited about the speed.
Yeah, fabulous. And what about you, Matthew? What is the perspective from Coursera and from your team?
No, I think we definitely agree with what Tom and Angèle said. And by the way, great and inspiring presentation, Angèle. Very memorable visual. So now we do believe that COVID has accelerated the digital transformation of universities and colleges, and what could have taken another 5 to 10 years to materialize is now unfolding in a matter of months. And the transition to online education can be challenging, but it is an imperative now. And the new normal, as we see it, will be more online and great. And sometimes when we think about innovation, we also think only about putting classes online, but it's not just that, like Angèle said at the beginning. It's also a question of delivering education in different ways. It's also a question of proposing different price points, and like also Tom mentioned. And in today's world, with the pace of change accelerating already, independent of COVID or not, many jobs and industries that we have today didn't exist 20 years ago. And higher education can also help organizations of all sorts, including companies and governments, upskill and reskill employees or workers throughout their lives, which is also a different types of innovation. And I also liked what Tom said about skills, because now the new currency in education is skills in a way. And hopefully this first accelerated innovation will help resolve some of the 3 fundamental issues that we see at Coursera, which is first, the lack of access to high quality education. Second, the cost of just attending. And third, being the gap between some of the skills learned and the skills needed for the desired job.
Great. Yeah, and I mean, I think the three of you each have such an interesting perspective in terms of you're all in this kind of innovation space, but yet you live in very different models. Angèle, you're very much you're an innovator and a designer who works for the kind of prestigious but traditional university. Tom, you founded Quantic because you wanted to design the business school of the future. So you were kind of looking at Angèle's, place and going, it's not for us, we can do something totally different, let's reimagine it. And Mathieu, you're from a team where you're looking at really blending and taking the coursework that existed in real life and making it exist online in a way that's really usable, and looking at learning models in terms of like that learning design that Angèle was talking about. And given these different perspectives, and maybe let's go the other direction just really quickly, is what is one thing or one attribute that you think has been really vital or really important from a learning design perspective, like that core thing that you think that students need to really be engaged and learn in an enriching way, given this digital transformation? So Mathieu, we'll start with you.
Oh, yeah. So yeah, it's an interesting question, because when we think about student experience and also educator experience, my previous work was all around designing customer journeys and understanding touch points and improving customer satisfaction every step of the way. And so similarly, when we think about the student and educator experiences, we can think about it through the same lens. And therefore we want to ask ourselves, what is their journey from, if we think about students, from onboarding, learning, getting access to technology, receiving counseling, and passing an exam. So these are all these critical moments in their lives as students. And we want to make sure, and particularly maybe to, if there was like one specific thing that we hope this type of new model would do, is first make it personalized, because people need to learn at different pace. People come from different backgrounds. People have different aspirations. So personalization is a key attribute of this student experience, along with, of course, experience that is engaging and eventually driving results.
And I agree with or sympathize a lot with what Mathieu was saying, but I think from our perspective, the silver bullet in educational technology, or where we think things need to go, is to make it very interactive. And so in our system, the student makes a choice every 8 seconds. Constantly they're making choices, and what that does is it drives the system to give them feedback. And so we're really teaching through feedback much more than we're teaching through lecture. And that keeps the student engaged because they're curious, they want to know, and every single few moments they're being challenged. Sometimes it's super simple, like the challenge, like anyone can get it right, but it just keeps you moving forward. And the engagement that we're enjoying right now is off the charts compared to traditional online education models, and we're sort of in the 90% plus kind of universe. And there's another sort of secret to the source, which is that I think students want to have a shared journey with peers, and there's a sort of network dynamic that emerges. And it's one of these challenges. A lot of us have gone into the field because we want to open up education to everybody. And at the same time, we see our role as community makers, the same way traditional education did. And so saying no to many somehow is the right thing for the community. And what you're trying to shape is a community of leaders for this business school. And so that's one of the sort of awkward and important decisions we make. Obviously, we're on our roadmap. We hope to roll out new schools that will be, let's say, more open or have a different selectivity criteria. But for now, that's been critical to our success.
And I'll add on to what Tom and Mathieu also said, that I think both Tom and Mathieu, you offered some great examples that I believe really reflect, maybe going back to that, the key or core attributes, which would be the needs, the needs of the students, the needs of the learners. And if we can be needs oriented and needs center as opposed to technology oriented, that's going to be a pretty important attribute, because technology, as we all know, comes and goes. It will evolve, but it must meet and ideally deliver a delightful experience, as we all know. And so I think an attribute, particularly around from a student perspective, is definitely they want to be heard, they want to have their needs met, and through the various options, which is so great to have Coursera and Quantic here, that those are great options for students to have, and their parents, again, who are paying. And then I'd say, in terms of an attribute from an educator's perspective, I think what really has evolved, and maybe we lost our way because I think we started this way, is that we really need the attributes of storytelling, and we need the attributes of curator, because there's such a vast amount of knowledge delivered in so many different ways, such as what Tom and Mathieu are even offering up. And that to be able to be a very good curator is a different skill set. And it's an attribute, I believe, sort of the 21st century educators really must be armed with. And ultimately, storytelling is going to deliver day in, day out. We love stories, we learn through stories. So I'd say those are sort of some of the key attributes.
Fabulous. Those are all really great. I just love that you're all sort of coming from a similar lens, but such different places. So, a slightly different question is, my team in particular, we've done a lot of research recently really around the prospective student space. And one of the biggest things that's come out of that work, it's been really fascinating. And one of the biggest things that's come out is that there's this pretty substantial gap in not really understanding what university is supposed to be, or what that experience will be like. And so it's almost like there's an opportunity for institutions to be able to create that new narrative. And more importantly, considering that if things are going to be digital anyways, how can institutions help prospective students make more informed decisions? And is there one thing that you would say from a digital perspective actually could make it a better experience for a high school student kind of transitioning into higher education?
So I'm going to twist it slightly because we're sort of focused on graduate school. And I think a lot of what we're trying to overcome all the time is the prejudice about what online education is. And so one of the tricks we've had is when you apply to us, one of the sort of application requirements during the sort of evaluation period is that you do courseware. And by students sort of going through interactive learning, they discover the power of our method. And so we benefit from more enrolling as a result of them trying. But also there's a sort of self-selection. If we're not a fit for you, then you discover that early on. And I think that more sort of work in general, as people are thinking about new ways to engage students and give them more of a sense of what they're getting themselves into, technology offers you this relatively low cost way to give people a chance to sample. And that's not been available in the past.
Mm-hmm. All right, Mathieu, what about you?
So two questions. And on the fundamental role of education, I like when Angèle said knowledge, because sometimes in the industry, we tend to only say what is to prepare for entering the workforce. But it goes without saying that in universities need to teach how to learn, since continuous learning is now a must-have. Make sure that students become responsible citizens and they have the ability to develop critical thinking through these formative years. And indeed, higher education train these thought leaders of tomorrow. So helping them become their better selves and achieve their goals or purposes are also sub-goals of higher education. And now to the question of how institutions can help prospective students to make more informed decision and in a way select which path to take. So I like the approach that Tom mentioned. And to this question, it's also going back to the student journey that universities can think about for this evaluation phase of opportunities. And I think even if universities do a good job of explaining what they teach, there's a lot of rankings out there with publications, including having many criteria on job outcomes and tons of different criteria. There's still room for innovation in this particular selection phase. So for instance, how about letting students try out these classes online, which I think Tom, you're mentioning for your company. How about facilitating conversations between alumni and prospective students through online communities? And so for instance, one of the things that we do at Coursera, in addition to having more than 4,000 courses, is we now have 19 fully online degrees, bachelor's and master's from our university partners. And what we allow is that for students, they can, as they want, try some classes today. So they can try, for instance, I had checked one of our partners, Imperial College of London, on their Global Master of Public Health. And there's about 7 classes that you can try out. And that's only one example. And if you complete these classes, then these will count against your future degree. And if you complete them and you don't like it, then you can try another university. But I think it's very important to insert and inject a lot of innovation in this phase too.
Great.
I was going to say, I'll add, again, very little. I think I just so agree. I know you're going to think, what, where are the arguments here? I'm not going to introduce any arguments. If anything, I also fully believe that sampling and experiencing a taste of what a course might offer is phenomenal. And if anything, that just speaks to possibly even the way high schools have to really rethink how they teach as opposed to those of us in higher ed. But also, I guess what I'd love to really look at, I haven't had a chance to do that even in my research, is really this idea of a gap year. And that whole transition from high school age and particularly in parts of Canada where you literally, when you're 17, you move, as opposed to cégeps in Quebec, which you give that little bit of a transition year. I think there's a lot to be said about, again, thinking about that human experience of where they're at, because the conditions in which you make a decision as a high school student, you don't have a lot of control. Someone's paying, you have to figure out where to live. Like there's just like, it's a very complex decision. And so when you introduce the question around informed decision-making, you've got to understand the conditions and the factors in which that decision is made. And unfortunately, a lot of it is driven from economics. And so sometimes, and I'm sure I have many dear friends who opted not to pursue a dream or not to actually follow a particular path because their parents were paying, or they felt they needed to get an engineering degree before getting that arts degree. So I think we probably all have friends that we can relate to in terms of the decisions we make. Those informed decisions, I think, come with a little bit of control and a little bit more experience, as my colleagues here have suggested. And so I think we can't really discuss sort of informed without really understanding the variety of conditions. And unfortunately, they really are socioeconomic.
Yeah. Do you think, both Tom and Matthew, you both mentioned this idea of like trialing, and that really is a good way to set expectations as well as get people kind of like hooked on the content and knowing that it's the right choice for them before they've committed to it. And, from a university perspective, you used to be able to do a campus tour. You can kind of audit classes, you could stumble in a classroom by accident and, like sit in and see what you enjoy and what you don't. And now that those classes are happening over Zoom, they're locked down, everyone's worried about Zoom bombing. You don't have that access to it. Like, do you think that that's something that will need to change, or do you think that that will just kind of not exist until in-classes can start again? Angèle, so it's a question for you.
Oh, so it was a question for me, and here I'm going, oh, that was a question. Well, it's funny because yes, that's right. I would think that whole idea of, and maybe I'll jump ahead to more of that hybrid of there's always going to be, I was going to say, I don't know if we can ever escape people hijacking an experience. I was going to say, whether it's in person, whether it's online. And so I think, if anything, the idea that you should be prepared for, let's say, the unexpected is probably what we really need to focus on our teaching, is preparing those learners to be continuous learners, as Mathieu said, and also be prepared for that unexpected. If something is hijacked or if something has to change, I think we have responsibilities as educators to help and guide and provide that type of knowledge so that we can navigate those uncertainties and navigate whether or not something has been completely just torn apart, or all of a sudden your content's been went from PG to restricted. And so I think there's, how do we, as educators, I think there's a whole amount of work that needs to be done from educators who may have been protected from this type of interaction with content, that they used to have it pretty much sealed, and it was within, their notebooks, and, being able to kind of provide that lecture, and for them to be aware that hackers and, the world and uncertainty is all around us. So I think there's a lot of education in terms of be prepared for the unexpected, and if something like that occurs, to be able to respond to it, I think, more responsibly and hopefully with a sense of humor.
Yeah, well, it's funny because it keeps being positioned as this really terrible thing, but like, I almost think that we should allow more of it, because then people can actually be a part of more organic conversation. But to the point of what do teachers need, and how do we really prepare educators to create a better experience? If you think about things like YouTube, where you can have 100 videos all explaining the same science concept, let's say, like science or math, or something a little bit more complicated, and one of those videos may have 50,000 views on it, while others only have a couple of hundred at most. It's engaging, it's being shared. So obviously this is an example where the student experience is more enjoyable, and really this idea of kind of like that education as entertainment, or creating more joy in educational content. And I think, given that that's a very different mandate than a lot of educators have been given before, like a mandate and also an allowance, what would be sort of your advice to educators about how to really embrace this new time of being able to create content that students can find a little bit more maybe engaging and joyous? So maybe we'll start with Matthew. Yeah.
I'm happy to start. This is a good question, because a lot of educators around us have not necessarily had any experience previously to teaching online, teaching behind Zoom, and there's a lot of best practices out there, particularly from our platform, but also other online platforms. And we actually have classes that people can take for free, unless they want a certificate, on how to teach online through Coursera. So that could be like one resource. And also, just as of earlier this week, our founder Andrew N was publishing a guide this Monday to answer all of these questions that are sometimes maybe not the most complicated one, but some of the basic questions, such as what's your teaching setup, what tools and supply do you need, and it's kind of like the Maslow pyramid of teaching, where first you need to have like the basic of digital literacy, and then once you have the basic of the setup and everything, then you can move into the next phase of how to make it engaging, how to make sure that your students turn on the Zoom camera, how to make sure that you use the forum to provide feedback, how to use your teacher assistant to engage with the community or the forums online. So it's kind of like different steps. And I think for many people right now, it might be the first step of like, let's get set up, the setup done for like the next 2 months. And then next year, or the fall semester, if a lot of universities are still not fully back on campus, which is likely, how to really get to the next level.
Yeah. Well, okay. And Tom, what would be your sort of advice to educators? I know, I'm sure everyone who's going to go and trial out those first couple of classes will see pretty quickly that a huge, one of the most noticeable things when you look at the Quantic curriculum is that there's all these little like jokes and puns kind of teased into it all over. So obviously that was a choice that your team made pretty early on. So what would be your advice about that for educators for how to sort of elevate their digital curriculum game?
Yeah, so I think that you have to captivate, and one of the ways we do that is obviously, like you say, through story. But story in our format is really about role play. So we try to very quickly get the student navigating the experience as if they're the accountant or as if they're the statistician. And we sort of provide them with the stimuli right away of a problem, and we get them right away to start responding to that. And so I think that the sort of the entertainment is in two ways. One is that you want funny stories with humor, but the other one is that I actually think the brain loves simple puzzles that it can solve. And the third thing is that the brain loves progressing. And so we build in progression in this building block manner through the interactive experience. And then obviously the icing on the cake, if you like, is that we make the stories ones with lots of sort of puns and kind of crazy product choices and so on that makes the user smile and kind of delight at the effort and humor that's been put into it. And I think in general, when professors are looking at how to develop engaging learning, my take is that, we went to these lecture theaters in education, sort of call it a 19th century phenomenon. Before that, it was always much smaller fora for a smaller part of the population. And we went to lecture theaters really because it was the only way to scale. And we had these knowledge experts that we wanted to get up on stage. But technology, because it's interactive, affords us the opportunity to go back to that sort of original method of teaching that's much more interactive. So, whether that's the tutoring methods that you might find at, Oxford University or something like that, or it's more of the sort of mentorship dynamic that you could have in a very practical learning kind of situation when you're doing something vocational. But our belief is that there's this way, if you think about how can I make this so that there's very high frequency of interaction, you can actually have the user or the student be in a decision-making process right there. And that's important when you're developing skill, because skill is kind of at least from where we stand, it's like mental models, and you have to teach those by sort of saying if this then that, and create the whole variation of potential applications of those sort of operations, even as you have to impart some information. But we're very focused on know-how.
Great. And then, Angèle, I know you mentioned a lot in your original presentation, so I won't make you regurgitate it again. But it sounds like definitely a lot of that storytelling and whatnot is really great, and that you're looking at innovative ways to work with your colleagues as well, which is fabulous. So I have a couple of questions in the Q&A box that I want to put forward. I will start with, we have Jessica. I'm not going to try and say that last name. We have Jessica. Her question is for you, Tom. It is that you blue oceaned the industry of receiving a master's degree. As you mentioned, more people are applying to your master's program, whether due to COVID or not, which is making admissions slightly more competitive. In, let's say, 1 minute or less, what could you recommend to someone applying to your program, especially during this time, this pandemic, that can set them apart from others?
No, I mean, I think that as you apply, I think just be true to yourself. We look for leaders of the future kind of thing. So, when your passion comes through, that you want to, shape your industry, things like that, that's impactful, obviously. Yeah, I'd leave it at that.
Perfect. I think in general, it sounds like, this is definitely a buyer's market when it comes to education too, where it's, you have the opportunity to really, make it well known what your passions are and try and go there, which I think is really great. So Ellington Jones said, multiple industries will face an uncertain future as a result of COVID-19. How will educational institutions need to adapt to provide their students with skills that will thrive in this type of environment? I don't know, Angèle, what do you want to start, or Matthew?
Sure, I'll start. Well, of course, I'm biased, so I'm very biased because I love the idea of teaching individuals how to think innovatively. And it's one of those things where we have learnt in our lifetimes how to do it on the job. Like it was not a formal way of learning. We did it through practice. We did it through play. We did it through trial and error. And there is a better way. There's a better way of doing it. And what Tom is kind of hinting at in terms of an online perspective is actually how do we, whether it's blended, in-person, hybrid, is that how can we provide that immersive experience of, let's say, that innovation approach, like the ability to navigate uncertainty as opposed to try to control it, is really, really critical. So of course, I'd say that the skills that will take you forever, regardless of, let's say, through another era, is your ability to be open to new experiences, your ability to adopt new ideas, new constructs, and your ability to adapt. And those are the three critical attributes of an innovative mindset.
Fabulous. All right, and Matthew, you had something that you wanted to say as well.
No, I was just going to add what we do also with our partners, because we have about 200 university partners and we work with more than 2,000 companies and governments, is that we publish every year a global skills index along with some essential skills playbooks. So we, throughout the year, we speak every single day with our university partners. So we give them the feedback from companies and industries on what are the skills that we really need to develop and to teach for companies, so that really helps institutions, to the question that was asked, understand what are the new curriculum, what are the new classes that they need to provide so that students can thrive in this new environment, like you said. So that's really how we do it.
Okay, thank you. And then very, very quickly, one last question. So with the online community that you're creating with your courses, do you feel a sense of responsibility towards your students as would attending a traditional institution? So do you see potential risks? Should they raise negative experiences with other community members, and how would you handle them? So Tom, maybe we'll throw that over to you because I know there's quite a community element too.
Yeah, so I think people, when they're invested in the community, actually behave themselves rather well. I remember when Facebook first came online and your identity was more true, people, in general, sort of shifted to being more sort of decent in their interactions. Not perfect, but more decent. And the same kind of happens in our format. And I think that there's such value in being part of the community. Obviously, if someone is unpleasant to another peer, we'll look into it, and we have no hesitation about shutting people out of the alumni community. But that is not a normal occurrence. People are thrilled to be able to connect to all the phenomenal people that we enroll, and we have a whole sort of an integrated online sort of search directory for you to be able to sort of connect and reach out to fellow students and alumni. And I think that makes them very conscious that there's an asset that they want to continue to have over time, and that means you have to sort of behave. So we've literally never had a misdemeanor to date, yeah. I don't know if that's the only reason why, but yeah, we don't run into issues the way you would on a physical campus.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, we're kind of at time now, and I just want to say thank you so much. I know I've taken a great deal of everybody's time. I'm just going to quickly share a screen as well, just as a quick reminder of who everyone is that was here, so that you can kind of keep this on. We are recording this, so it will be shared as well. So you can feel free to share it with your communities and make sure that everybody does get a chance. Very last thing is, I'd love to just throw it out there. We are going to be doing a working session. I'm not requiring people to be there, but if you have a social handle that you would love to provide to say, hey, if you have questions or comments, or if they didn't get a chance to ask their question here, or they, you know, it comes up an hour from now, who knows, I'd love to be able to ask you to share your social handle so people can get in touch with you if they do have further questions. So let's go, Angèle.
My social handle?
A preference of one.
Oh, would be Twitter, and I'd say it's Angel Sun.
Okay, perfect. Angel Sun on Twitter. Tom, what about yourself? What's your favorite social media?
Okay, at Tom_Adams.
Perfect, and that's on Twitter.
Yep.
Okay, and Matthew?
Best is LinkedIn. I do have Twitter, but I use LinkedIn more frequently. So first name, dot last name, and you'll find me quickly.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate it. As a quick reminder, we do have this working session on Friday. You can sign up for it on Eventbrite. You can also be in touch with us. I know Art from our team posted it in the chat. He just posted it again. Perfect. So we'd love to have whoever would like to continue the conversation or be more involved in the conversation and really look at how do we action some of what we've learned today. That would be fabulous. And then we do also have a couple more events that are coming up in the next month, I guess a couple of weeks. So please do feel free to join us for all of those as well. We really enjoyed this conversation, and thank you again, Angèle, Tom, and Mathieu. We really appreciate all of your time and your insights and just sharing your knowledge and experience with us. So everybody have a great afternoon and evening, depending on where you are. I think some people were coming from all over the world, so probably in the morning. And have, a great day, and hopefully we'll see everyone at the next one.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brittany.
Thank you. Bye-bye.